Welcome everyone to this session, which is kind of particular in the sense that it is a joint session, and we hope that you're not completely exhausted from all the wonderful things you have been hearing all day and participating in. Dimiter and I would first of all like to thank Petros for accepting this rather unusual proposal of a joint book publication. And let me just say very briefly about the structure of the session. I will say a few introductory words about Dimiter, and he will present his book. Then Dimiter will introduce me very briefly, and I will present my book. And by that time, I hope that you, our virtual audience, will have certain questions to answer, and Dimiter and I will start this question and answer session by asking each other a secret question, okay, something that we would like to ask about our books. And though apparently unrelated, we believe that the two books offer their readers a unique opportunity to view culture at Nicaea through a broader perspective and an unconventional creative manner, a combination that Dimiter and I have already explored in a paper that we published jointly 2 years ago in the Jahrbuch der österreichischen Byzantinistik, and also another paper that Andrea Andreu and I published in Interfaces, the journal for medieval European literatures, a year ago. Obviously, I do not need to say much about Dimiter, given that he is an internationally acclaimed specialist of late Byzantine history. Besides this very most recent book of his, he has published a monograph on imperial ideology and political thought in Byzantium from 1204 to 1330 by Cambridge University Press in 2007. And he also collaborated intensively with the late Ruth Macready's and Father Joseph Munity's on a translation with substantial commentary of Pseudocodinosis treatise on offices and ceremonies published by Routledge in 2013. Dimiter worked briefly after his PhD at Harvard at Western Michigan University, and then for 10 whole years at the University of Birmingham before being appointed a Dumbarton Oaks Professor of Byzantine History at Harvard University in 2016. So, biographies of historical figures have not been fashionable in Byzantine studies in the past 50 or so years, and it is quite surprising that over the past days we have been seeing, and we will be seeing, new such biographies. It means that something is happening in the field, and that's worthwhile discussing. Especially the case of Theodore Laskaris is particular in the sense that he has been very understudied as a ruler, and I would say rather underrated as a ruler and an author. So please, Dimiter, go ahead and talk us a little bit about this scholarly adventure and relationship of you and Theodore.
Thank you, Panagiotis. I would also like to thank Petros for organizing the book festival, and would like to thank my publisher who suggested in the first place that I should participate in this event. It's a wonderful opportunity to learn about some new books and renew and create connections during a very challenging period. The Byzantine Hellene, the life of Emperor Theodore Laskaris in Byzantium in the 13th century. You can see the cover on your screen, appeared in August 2019. I conceived this book as a biography, as Panagiotis mentioned, and the book is a biography to the maximum extent I found possible of Theodore II Laskaris, who was born in Nicaea, ruled the so-called Empire of Nicaea, and whose life of 36 years covered about 2/3 of the history of this peculiar polity, which revived the Byzantine state in Western Asia Minor in the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade and expanded into the Balkans. How did this project originate? I have always been fascinated by reading biographies, even in my school years, and have seen the power of biography to tell stories, which is the story of individuals, but also the story of the world around them. So I have been on the lookout for a figure whose life can be reconstructed, thanks to abundant sources, from the childhood of that figure until the death, and whose story is telling and it's interesting. I came across Theodore II Laskaris while I was writing my earlier book on imperial ideology and political thought in the 13th and early 14th centuries. At that time, I noticed that many of the political, social ideas of Laskaris, whether on friendship and politics, on political conflict, on Hellenism, were or appeared to me highly peculiar, idiosyncratic. So I wish to explore how a biography of this figure can shed light on his thought world and make us understand better his mind. So here is the result, 10 years later. That's not the result, Panagiotis.
No, I'm going back, sorry.
Yeah, the previous slide. So as I was writing the biography, I came to realize that the story of Laskaris can tell us a great deal about the transformation of Byzantium after 1204. And I intentionally start the narrative with 1204 because so many echoes of these events are found in Laskaris, who was not born at that time, but many people around him spoke about Constantinople, about exile, and he had his own reaction. His story tells us a lot about Nicaea, about political tradition and innovation. A great amount of research had to be done on the letters of Laskaris and on his literary and philosophical works, especially on his autobiographical works, research which included preparing translations, which will appear in a separate volume. So this research has not been without challenges, which are generally the challenges of using Byzantine letters, satirical works, works of occasional rhetoric, in order to draw a portrait of the author. I have been greatly aided by Laskaris' style, which is immediate, self-revealing, self-obsessed, and the author who had a literary talent wanted his prose to be this way. It's a well-cultivated prose. And I have been aided also by the general consistency of his self-representation, by his love of narrative, and the inclusion of many realia of daily life in his letters in particular. Not the least, I have been helped by chronological clues in his writings and manuscript editions prepared under the supervision of the author, which has enabled me to suggest, sometimes establish a chronology. So some of this tedious work, which had to be done before I wrote the biography, it was a very necessary work on chronology, is found in the appendices to the book. The book is not only an intellectual biography, it's mostly and mainly a personal biography and the biography of a ruler. As I mentioned, by writing this book, I wish to understand better Laskaris as a philosopher and as a proud Hellene. So the last 2 of the 10 chapters of the book are assessments of Laskaris' philosophy and Hellenism. These 2 chapters have been in many ways the most challenging chapters to write. Why is this the case? While it is possible to draw a coherent biographical portrait of Laskaris, and while his ideas become clearer, I believe, in such biographical study, Laskaris died quite young. He had never the opportunity to develop some of his interpretation. And this is part of the tragedy, among many of Laskaris. It's a very dramatic story. And in these 2 last chapters on philosophy and Hellenism, I discuss a series of interesting patterns. Laskaris' critique of logic, his use of mathematics in theology, his cultivation of philosophical irony, and the intensification and politicization of his Hellenism as time went on. So as I mentioned, the book is primarily a personal biography and a ruler's biography. As a personal biography, it has reconstructed Laskaris' daily life, his thoughts, his very youthful emotions, anxieties at various times of his life. So the reader can learn in the book about trivial aspects of his life, diet, the culture of entertainment. The reader can also find plenty about how Laskaris approached the material and physical environment, cities in Western Asia Minor, the geography of Western Asia Minor. Most of all, the reader can learn a lot about the mentality of Laskaris. He was brought up as a royal. His brain was wired to think as a royal and the only heir to the throne, and he was allowed to use the title of emperor from a fairly early age. He was truly obsessed with his legacy and in the way he will be remembered by the future generation. He was also obsessed with being a philosopher ruler, an enlightened absolutist as a result of his brief philosophical education under the great Nikephoros Vlemidis, with whom he had a complex and evolving relationship traced in the book, and later with Acropolitis. So his obsession with legacy is reflected in the careful, meticulous preparation of editions of his work during his lifetime. Panagiotis, now we can put the next slide. With the help of scribes attached to the court, some of them copied more than one manuscript, who were given close instructions by Laskaris to put particular headings in this manuscript. 4 editions of his collected works were known before I wrote the biography, and with Panagiotis we identified a 5th edition of his works prepared just before Laskaris' death. And what is more, Laskaris prepared editions not only of collections but of individual works. So you can see here on the slide a folio from a deluxe edition of his Natural Communion, the most copied of the philosophical treatises of Laskaris. A deluxe edition which was prepared during the author's lifetime, and you see a drawing of concentric circles of the elements. The text, like many of Laskaris' texts, have not been approached carefully by philologists. I believe that this one is being edited by Christian Forstel, and at the moment we need to rely on Min's edition, which is not good at all. And this manuscript, in fact, is not taken into consideration. The biography is also the biography of a ruler, namely the reader can learn about how Laskaris was brought up at the court, about the mobility of the Nicaean emperors, about the court culture of entertainment, feasting, mime performances, reading of erotic fiction, the culture of humor and teasing among a tightly knit group of courtiers who did not hesitate to make fun of bishops in a quite irreverent manner. It's among this group of friends and associates of the court that Laskaris recruited his officials when he became the sole emperor in 1254, using them as a tool against a powerful and entrenched aristocracy. The biographical structure of the book has made it possible to trace changing political preoccupations at different points of his life. One of the many discoveries has been on the duties and responsibilities of Laskaris as a junior emperor, which I have pieced together from his letters, but also from seals, documents, and Western sources. In short, as the Empire of Nicaea expanded greatly into the Balkans in the 1240s, and as his father, the senior emperor, was absent on campaigns for a great part of the year, Laskaris traveled to cities and villages in the core area of the state of Nicaea, supervised imperial estates, made minor appointments, and dispensed law justice on fiscal matters and property disputes. His sole emperorship between 1254 and 1258 was full of action, which this book tells. Actions and drama. There were wars, a reception of Latin, Mongol, and Bulgarian embassies, a promotion of a new service elite, conflict with the aristocracy, and a disease in the last year of his life, which is a subject to an appendix, during which we actually learn about his full disdain for doctors who were employed by the court and continually cared for the only and precious royal heir. In short, this is a rich book, and it could have been an even richer book, but I realized that this is impossible and resisted the temptation to make it even longer. It's over 400 pages with the notes and the appendices. My goal has been to tell the story of Laskaris without too many digressions on the broader setting, and to show how one can write a historical narrative from the point of view of one key individual, and with the help of the very expressive, dramatic, at times opinionated voice of this individual. It's a story with an abrupt end, the death of my protagonist, the downfall of his dynasty, the restoration of Constantinople, which itself raises questions about alternative histories, contingency, and the way today we construct our own historical narratives. At this point, I'll end my presentation, and without any delay whatsoever, I will invite Panagiotis to give his presentation, because we have devised this session in such a way that you'll be answering the questions after hearing the two presentations. So let me say a few words about Panagiotis Agapitos, who is an internationally acclaimed specialist in Byzantine literature. Besides this new book, he has published the critical edition of Livistros and Rodamne at the Cultural Foundation of the Bank of Greece in 2006, and an edited volume together with Lars Mortensen on narratives between history and fiction in a medieval European periphery at Copenhagen University Press in 2012. His new book is a translation of Livistros and Rodamne based on his own edition. His particular interest in narrative has found a creative outlet in the writing of crime novels set in 9th century Byzantium. He was appointed in 1992 at the newly founded University of Cyprus, where he has been active in establishing a vibrant Byzantinist and medievalist community. He is currently a Humboldt Foundation visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute for European Legal History in Frankfurt. His translation of Livistros and Rodamne, which is projected on the screen, is based on the earliest version of the longest and most complex of the Byzantine romances. It will certainly be welcomed by both scholars and especially by the general public and by students who can all learn more about the literature, literary tastes, and cultural ethos at the Byzantine court and beyond after the fall of Constantinople in 1204. So without any delay, Panagiotis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dimiter. Well, let me start by saying that in contrast to Dimiter's full-scale biography of Theodore II Laskaris, my book is a translation of the tale of Livistros and Rodamne. It's one of the 8 surviving Byzantine vernacular verse romances and is part of a broader narrative, fiction narrative in the later Byzantine times. But let me start by saying that translations into English of Byzantine vernacular literature are few and far between. Consequently, in contrast to translations from Anglo-Saxon or medieval English into modern English, there is no tradition of translating such medieval Greek poetic texts with which a translator could connect and profit from. The reason for this absence is that vernacular texts are either viewed as not typically Byzantine, or they are read simply as early modern Greek literature, not related to Byzantine culture. Upon closer reading, however, Livistros and Rodamne proves to be an extraordinarily Byzantine work, but at the same time also a puzzling text. Eleanor was most probably composed at the imperial court of Nicaea by an educated poet during the last decade of the reign of John III Vatatzis, who, as you know, died in 1254, while Theodore was co-emperor to his father and himself producing highly individualist learned texts. It was in this context, as already Dimiter suggested, that Hellenistic and Komnenian erotic fiction was being read, as Theodore himself reveals in the only recently discovered essay of his. And you will see, you have here the manuscript transmitting this text that Dimiter and I edited, and the red sentence is the sentence that suggests that he was reading fictions. Gamike mythoplastie is a very interesting word for basically romance. With its approximately 4,700 verses, political verses, as they're usually called in English, I prefer the word city verses because they are related to the polis and not to politics. Livistros and Rodamne is the longest and most artfully crafted of the love romances. It was almost certainly written to be recited in front of an aristocratic audience. Its poet had a solid rhetorical training and a good reading experience of the Greek tradition of erotic fiction, yet he was also knowledgeable of the medieval French and possibly Persian love romances. In fact, the anonymous poet of Eleanor created a modernist poetical narrative filled with attractive episodes, including the only scene of demonic incantation in Byzantine fiction. What made LNR puzzling to older scholars was its seemingly erratic textual transmission, out of which no imaginary original could be constructed in the old ways of classical philology. Moreover, the romance's plot is acted out in a fluid setting involving Latins, Armenians, Persians, Egyptians, but no Byzantine characters. Over the past 30 years, the puzzle of LNR is being gradually solved. The textual transmission has been understood, and new critical editions of 2 out of the 3 independent redactions have provided a sound basis to interpret the text as a literary work of art. For example, what do I mean by that? How has the poet created a multi-layered narrative order of his story, or organized complex spatiotemporal notions? How has he combined old and new techniques for the representation of characters and of settings? Or how he has handled the discourse of love and the practice of desire? Interestingly enough, Livistros and Rodamne is the only Byzantine romance that consistently constructs the Latin, by which we have to understand French, world of chivalry as an exotic setting, a type of Occidentalism aiming to incorporate the Latin other in the social norms of the Byzantine self after the fall of Constantinople to the Crusaders of 1204. One impressive feature of the romance is the creation of the erotokratia, or amorous dominion in my translation, the imaginary kingdom of Eros, who is not the ancient Erotidevs, but the Byzantine Vasilevs, governing his subjects through a proper administrative apparatus and in a manner strikingly similar to Laskarid Nicaea. Another impressive feature is the overall organization of the romance, where the narrative is being told by the main characters as first-person narrators in a series of complex, self-contained, and yet interconnected stories. In this sense, LNR clearly shows us that the conventional division between learned and vernacular Greek does not accurately reflect literary practices in Byzantium, at least since the 11th century. In contrast to other volumes in the translated texts for Byzantinist series of Liverpool University Press, the translation of Livistros and Rodamne has no explicative notes accompanying the romance's text. The reason behind this choice is that I firmly believe, especially through my experience as a writer of historical crime novels, that all narrative fiction should be read as autonomous, with no exegetical apparatus. Instead of this typical philological feature, the volume includes a 50-page introduction where I have gathered together a number of my old ideas about LNR along with some new ones. In its first part, the introduction presents all general matters pertaining to the romance, such as the genre of erotic fiction, LNR in older scholarship, its textual transmission, date, place of composition, and primary audience. In the second part, the introduction, along with a plot summary, develops 8 interpretive themes: the text's relation to the Greek novelistic tradition, but also to the old French romances, exoticism and gender, poetics, narrative techniques, amorous discourse as didacticism, And finally, the interconnection of political power and the power of Eros. Lastly, I would like to point out that the language of Eleanor is of a high poetic quality, challenging the translator at every step. Though there exists an English translation of the Romance published by Gavin Betts in 1995, it is not satisfactory for a number of reasons. Therefore, this volume in the TTB series offers the first fully scholarly translation into English of Livistros and Rodamne. It is the result of many years of work in preparing the critical edition of the poem's oldest redaction and in reading the Romance as a serious piece of medieval literature. In contrast to modern practice, I have kept the verse structure of the original, allowing at points phrases to look back to English poetry of the early 18th century. Obviously, I had to make a number of choices when rendering the complex compound words or the artful rhetoric of the Romance's poetic discourse. I have made a special effort to render in a distinct poetic idiom all the terminology describing the imperial domain of Eros with its ministers, councils, and military guards. One particular aspect of the medieval text that, to a certain extent, I have kept in the translation is the alternation between past and present tense in the stories of the first-person narrators, in order to render something of the peculiar effect of the Greek Romance on its listeners. I hope that my choices have not distorted a difficult, but in my opinion, beautiful text, for ultimately my aim was to offer an English text that can be read or even recited on its own. I would therefore like to conclude this brief presentation by reading to you a short passage. It is the moment when, after a very long courtship between Livistros and Rodamne, she has agreed to meet him at the edge of a forest away from the meadow and the castle where she lives. Livistros, ruler of the Latin kingdom of Livandros, narrates to his friend Clitovon, the prince of the Armenian kingdom of Litavia, how this momentous day where he meets his love began and what he saw. At some point, dawn's amorous star arrived. I saw the sun. The light started at last to shine. I call and rouse a page of mine. He saddles my horse, a shining steed, fully caparisoned with precious pearls. Its mane was dyed with the color of henna. I arm myself with an exquisite cuirass, shining red, studded with precious pearls. From now on, I watch for the maiden to cross the meadow. I see the maiden. My mind begins to tremble, my friend, from the remembrance of the sun-born beauty. I see the maiden at dawn. She crosses the meadow. The meadow that is embellished by her thousand charms. Her palfrey was icy white like snow. Its tail and mane were interlaced with tassels made out of silk dyed red. They burned like flames, and you might say that they glittered from within the snow. The beauteous maiden's dress was Latin. Over it, she was wearing a golden red surcoat. Its brightly colored train was trailing on the ground. On one hand, she bore a tame parrot who perched untethered and spoke in a human voice. The maiden enslaves even souls, unenslaved to love. She binds free hearts and subjugates lonely beings, nurtured by mountains and deserted regions. I stood still, admiring the wondrous maiden, her exquisite beauty, her indescribable appearance, and wondered about that bird, how it could be enslaved and be speaking in a human voice about its own enslavement. I saw the maiden at dawn as she crossed the meadow. I step out of my tent. With great joy, I leave my dwelling. It truly seemed to me that I was running on top of the clouds. For a soul that imagines the amorous concern of a beautiful girl believes that rough land is smooth and crosses it unimpeded. Thank you.